All right. Then welcome everyone, and good afternoon everyone, to Mitigant's webinar today, and we will talk about how to prepare your cloud for NIS2 directive with Mitigant. So introduction first, briefly for those who don't know me. My name is Isan. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Result GmbH, or basically, and we are basically from Mitigant.io. So I did my PhD in the Internet Technologies and System at Hasselblad Institute in Potsdam. So I've published actually more than 21 scientific articles in journals together with my colleagues, Kennedy as well on the call. And I did also previously as well a research collaboration project with Bundesdruckerei and SAP um, for their security research projects, basically. So let's start for that. So first thing first that we should already know, I would say in these days as well as the cyber attacks are on the rise these days, right? So 28% of the European small medium enterprises have experienced cyber crimes, basically, and a lot of companies that we heard so many times these days as well have been affected by ransomware attacks, where their whole networks and their confidential data are getting encrypted, and they have to pay hundreds or even millions of euros basically to for them to get back their data and services back again. And it is estimated by for every time there's a data breach happening, it could cost medium-sized or even large enterprises up to in average of like 4 million US dollars basically. That's because that it's not only, well, we are talking about many things here. When it comes to data breach, we are talking about, first one is obviously the investigation wise and how to fix the issues and right to prevent it again, and also like a lot of things as well. Let's say if when there is something, let's say regarding confidential data of the customer, for example, then you have to pay fines basically to the government. For example, in Europe there's a GDPR happening, right? So and then every time that there's like a date like customers data getting involved for that, then you have to certain fines for it. So now we are talking about the Network Information Security, or NIS directive. It's basically the first time of the European Union actually introduced such a legislation for cybersecurity. The aim is that basically that with the number of cyber attacks that are happening and also increasing from long time ago, and then now it's basically like when everything become digitalized or digital transformations happening, basically the European Union would like to make sure that each of the European Union member states, as well as the organizations operating within them as well, have to have a high common level of cybersecurity strategies basically implemented for them, right? And that is the reasons why. So 2016 it was introduced, and then 2018 it was established for EU member states basically, as in that like a lot of these EU member states actually implemented this NIS directive into certain of into their law, their national laws basically for it. And according to some statistics as well from the European Union itself, the ENISA, for example, like which is the European Union for the cybersecurity agency for it, 81.84% of the respondents of the from all across the European Union member state actually implemented NIS directive. However, I think the issue here with the NIS directive is that one of the challenges for the NIS directive is that like it seems that there is there is a lack of like, let's say a common ground basically of the implementation of the cybersecurity strategy that we are talking about in this directive. For example, maybe within Germany and versus the Belgium, or maybe in Netherlands, for example, the spending as well as that like the level of implementation wise for cybersecurity and maybe data privacy and so on are way different with each other, right? So that is the reasons why that NIS actually the first NIS actually does not is considered to be a good legislative, but they can do better. And that's where the NIS2 directive, which is the new derivation of from the NIS directive, from the original NIS directive as well. So and that's the case as well for this. So it's not only just like basically applying like making new strategies basically for it, like make suring everyone actually has a better strategies as cybersecurity strategies for protecting their confidential data, and also making sure as well every EU member state as well the organizations including affected by it as well has to have a uniform, let's say, a level of cybersecurity implementation for it, but it also at the same time as well is that it has to evolve as well with the evolving of the cyber attacks happenings on with the recent years, especially with the new technologies that are being adopted this year. For example, with the Internet of Things, for example, when in 2016 and so on, it's still like in the early years of adoption, and now it's like in 2024, it's already like a really crucial part of it as well. And as well as that now as well with the AIs happening as well, artificial intelligence being adopted and so on, and that's gonna be that is will be something that have to be taken care of as well within the NIS2 directive. So as I mentioned on the left, as you can see there, there are several points, basically some main points of like what the NIS2 directive is new, has more in place compared to NIS directive basically. And then in this case as well, that the on October 17 is the deadline for the EU member states to implement NIS2 directive as a national legislation. Meanwhile, also by the April 17 as well, 2025 next year, EU member state has to already be able to identify affected organization by NIS2 directive, meaning that they will have to compile the list of companies that are affected by NIS2 directive and make sure that they are already compliant with it. So also, if you have any question, please feel free to put it in the chat, and then I will answer it after my sessions. Thank you very much for that. Yes, and regarding as well, regarding the affected entities by NIS2 directive. So as you can see here, it's just like a really overview of what's happening there. We essentially have like two types of entities that are affected: essentials and important entities. So as you can see, the one on the green one basically are the one that's already applied by NIS, the first NIS directive. Basically, these are the critical infrastructures, I would say. But then the blue one are the one that added within the NIS2 directive as well. And obviously, like on the green one as well, the one on the greens, it's also including more and more categories inside of it as well. So in total, there are almost 15 entities for it as well. As you can see, the transportation, banking, financial markets, and so on. And yeah, so another thing as well that what you can see as well is that not all of the entities that are working in this, not all entities or organizations within these sectors are going to be affected by NIS2 directive. And in this regard, the rule of thumb is that like if you have more than 50 employees and then you have 10 million euro of total revenue in this regards, then you are most likely going to be affected by NIS2 directive. That is basically the general direction of NIS2 directive. However, that like each of the countries basically can also specify, let's say, a different can also add as well, let's say, more sectors as well, like more specification of this of the companies or entities that are affected by, maybe for example, less maybe a smaller entities, for example, a small medium enterprises, maybe like 10 or 25 employees could also be affected by it. Also gonna be depending on the implementation of the NIS2 directive by each of the EU member states. So basically, everyone should also be careful of like regarding the NIS2 directive. So, but here's the thing, right? In Germany alone, according to some statistics as well, that it is predicted more than 10,000 companies are going to be affected by NIS2 directive. And many of them are still new. The one that I mentioned before as an expanded scope, basically, of the NIS2 directive, they are going to be affected by it and they might not realize it yet. Meaning that like they do not know that whether they have to comply with it, or hopefully they already have some cybersecurity strategy in place basically to make sure every aspect within their companies or stakeholders as well are protected with the cybersecurity strategies implemented already for it. However, then as from my experience as well, talking to many of the companies over the past year or so, a lot of companies actually that are supposed to be within this NIS2 directive as well do not yet realize that they should have been affected by NIS2 directive. And that's really worrying, I would say, in my opinion, is because that that companies affected by NIS2 directive from the graph before as well, that it has to be compliant with the NIS2 directive by October 17. So currently, right now, today, as it is right now, they have to make sure that all of the, let's say, the all of the requirements to be up, let's say, to be compliant with the NIS2 directive, although that currently it's not yet as a national law, they have to make sure that their entities actually have already fulfilled the requirements to be NIS2 compliant. Because when the deadline's happening, which is the October 17th for the deadline for the law to be adopted by the EU member states to be national law, it will be on effect on day one basically, and there is gonna be no grace period, meaning that on October 17th, once all the laws have been already created basically based on the NIS2 directive, then it will already start as well to checking as well technically, like whether the companies or entities in this regards as well have to be already complied with NIS2 directive or not. And so because of that, then when we're talking about the consequences, and if what if that, let's say, the entities do not yet comply to NIS2 directive, so there are basically three, let's say, three possible outcomes of sanctions that basically that can happen. The first one is, in the rule of thumb, there could be administrative fines up to 2% of the global revenue or 10 million euros. And this could be more, even more as well, if you're in a critical sector. This is basically for us, for critical sector. This one is actually for the important sectors, fines for it. The second one as well is non-monetary remedies, meaning that like uh, you don't like you're basically are forced basically to do, let's say, security audits, or maybe you have to also to comply as well to the NIS2 as soon as that you receive this kind of order as well, right? And for the upper level management, for example, depending on, how let's say how big the non-compliance is basically for the entity as well, the upper level management could receive sanction or even liability as well, meaning that, for example, they can basically are not allowed to hold the managerial position for a certain time basically, or even they could risk also getting the fine as well basically for that. So again, these are still really really like kind of like the general direction of the NIS2 directive, but this really shows as well how European unions basically are really, really, let's say, caring about the cybersecurity within the EU member states because of the increasing number of cyber attacks over the past few years. And now, when we are talking about the cloud infrastructure and NIS2 directive, basically, like obviously as we've seen as well, as you probably also aware or maybe experienced as well, many of the cloud infrastructures as well have been used by entities a lot as well. A lot of companies are migrating their data from their private servers into the cloud, either private cloud, public cloud, or maybe multi-cloud, combination of both basically, right? From AWS, Azure, Google, or even maybe like smaller cloud providers, or even, let's say, having their own private cloud as well using Kubernetes or something like that. This is really normal nowadays as well, as you can see, right? And this is because that like using cloud basically helps a lot as well for due to the flexibility and scalability of the infrastructure, also pay as you go as well for many customers as well, and many as well offering like a lot of like, let's say, functionalities that are well beyond that what's usually provided within the private server. For example, like the AI, if you are using AI, for example, and you obviously need a high computational power, and then sometimes it might not be easily covered within your own private servers, obviously, for that, right? So 60% of the enterprise data are stored in the cloud, and approximately 45.2% of European enterprises are currently using clouds. So these are in general terms. For each country, it might be different, for example. And as you can see on the right as well, these are just the statistics of like how the usage of like the cloud infrastructures as well for the companies for that. But also at the same time as well, that since a lot of companies are migrating to the clouds, right, this also means that as well that this become a new target for cyber attacks. And we have seen so many times of cloud attacks, ransomware attacks, data breaches, a lot of like things happening, cloud account takeovers as well. You have seen it so many times in the news about the number of cloud attacks over the years. For example, the latest one, for example, is the one from Motel One, that they got their servers hacked, and then the ransomware actually stole the customer credit card data, as well as that they also encrypted so the data, for example. And then, but the interesting thing is that 99% of the cloud attacks happen due to human errors and misconfigurations. And this means that, like, let's say if you are using, let's say, storage database or storages, for example, for that, if you are not making sure that your data or your storages are not warily configured to make sure that it's only being can only be accessed by certain people, for example, then obviously everyone else in the internet can access it. And if you store confidential data, then it's already data breaches in this regard, right? And then you have to pay fines for it and so on. You have to take care of it and respond and so on. That's the case. And 80% of the companies have been affected by cloud attacks in different sizes of cloud attacks, whether it's just a simple, let's say, maybe data breaches, for example, or maybe like even like the whole interrupted services, basically because of the denial of services, for example. This could happen by a lot of companies these days, right? Especially if they are using the clouds. So when it comes to the cloud itself, cloud is basically not really, let's say, how to put it this way, like cloud is an infrastructure, obviously, where people store the data, can run their services, basically, for sure. But there are still also a lot of things as well that can support basically cloud infrastructure for the entities as well. For example, in this case, when we are talking about the NIS2 directive as well, how does it affect the cloud, for example? And here I'm just giving the 6 examples for it as well. These are the one affected by the NIS2 directive. For example, the first one is the inventory management. Yeah, well, in this case, like, for example, you have to know, for example, whether how your cloud is, basically how many, let's say, storages, virtual machines that you have running, who has access with it, who has access to those resources, what, and then how is it configured, for example, right? And how is it connected with other resources, for example. This kind of inventory management is something that you have to know first, basically, for that, right? Tracking and monitoring is another thing, meaning that you have to be able to understand as well what's going on within your cloud infrastructure. You have to know as well what's the latest activities, if there's something suspicious happening, and also obviously as well if there are things that are changing happening in your infrastructure, right? So that's the case. So another thing as well is testing and compliance. So a lot of like companies as well, now when we are talking about NIS2 directive, you would like to make sure that it is gonna be compliant to certain standards, basically. Obviously, for example, like in Germany, for example, there are already certain regulations, for example, for critical infrastructure. You have to, for example, if you're using clouds, then maybe you are being subjected to use, for example, BSIC 5, for example, or maybe you can use as well ISO 27001, for example. Then you have to be able to show that you are complying with these standards, best practices on the market, but also at the same time as well that you also have to make sure as well that it's also ready for cyber attacks, right? You have to be able to test it, for example, maybe with a simple scanning, for example, or maybe you can also do like penetration testing, basically to make sure that everything is correct and everything is also like secure and so on. So that's the testing and compliance. Supply chain security is, let's say, a new hot topic in the past few years as well, as the idea was just like to make sure that everything that is used within your infrastructure, for example, if you're running services, if you're running applications, for example, you have to make sure that all of the, let's say, all of the dependencies or applications wise and so on do not have, let's say, vulnerabilities that can be affected by that can be, let's say, exploited by third party users, for example, and which can lead to cloud attacks or maybe like some cloud security breaches, for example, something like that. So the supply chain security is really important because then, like, if you are already, let's say, can affect like an application or services or whatever it is that you're running within your infrastructure, and then if it's already has some vulnerabilities within, and this or has, let's say, has a 0-day vulnerabilities, for example, then this could be a problem for everyone in this regard, right? So you will have to make sure that not only the infrastructure itself is secure, but everything running inside of it as well is secure. Incident reporting is a new thing as well within the NIS2 directive. So in this regard, let's say if you, let's say, God forbid, for example, you got an incident happening in your cloud infrastructure or even your entities in general, basically, maybe you got hacked or maybe there was like a ransomware attack, or data breaches and so on, you actually now have to report this, and send it as well, this report as well. So there are multiple steps on to do so. So like the first 24 to 72 hours, you have to already send, let's say, like a simple report explaining what's happening. and then after that as well, up to 30 days later on, you have to create a full report as well of what's going on and how you actually already detected it, investigating it, as well as that, like, how you might also would start to do the prevention or maybe like to remediate the issues as well. This incident reporting is also really important as well, because now there is also a new entities within the NIS2 directive as well that will that is actually is going to be set up basically, that will handle all of this incident reporting as well for that. um, and finally, zero trust security. So within the zero trust security, which is really also another hot topic as well these days, where basically you have to make sure that in general all of the components of your infrastructure as well have to be secure, and then making sure that like everything else that you can prove, then it means zero trust, and then zero trust can mean anything in this regard. But essentially, from my point of view, zero trust security means that you have to make sure that you have necessary authentications, or also like necessary as well configuration, in a sense that like anything else that you're providing as well will be enough to make sure that you are an authorized person to have access to the infrastructure, and also your services application as well can run securely as well within your infrastructure. So that's a zero trust security, meaning that you don't trust basically anyone in this regard, quote unquote, for that. So basically in here we are giving you some tips as well on how to make the cloud NIS2 ready, obviously based on what I mentioned before as well. So just to put it in a simple terms, so the first one that I would like to talk about as well is the first one, that we can take inventory of available cloud resources across cloud regions and services and categorize them based on priority level. What it means by that, for example, that you know how many, as I mentioned before, inventory management, how many resources that do you have, basically cloud resources, where is it located, how is it configured, who has access to it, right? And and I do know as well, like let's say when it comes to certain cloud providers as well, like AWS or Azure or Google, for example, it might not be very easy to have like this inventory management within one view basically for it. That's because that, like for example, when it comes to AWS, sometimes you have to go to certain services, AWS services, for example, and also will go to maybe certain region as well, and then you have to keep changing the regions to know all of the resources basically available there. So that's just a case which is also normal as well nowadays within the other public cloud provider as well. But obviously this creates certain kind of like limited visibility of like how many resources that do you have, because otherwise then the things like you have to keep monitoring as well every day to check, okay, yesterday I think I have 11, now today I have a 12. Is there something new, and then which one is the new resource that I have created, or is there something changing the configuration wise? So that is something that you will have to understand as well, when it comes to the inventory management of the cloud infrastructure. So obviously the second thing as well, to ensure your cloud resources are correctly and securely configured based on cloud security best practices and standards. So, and this is really interesting as well, because that I would say when it comes to this as well, the default configuration of the cloud resources are not the secure configuration. You as the users, basically, or cloud customers in this regard, have what is called a shared responsibility model with the cloud provider, meaning that you as the cloud customers have to ensure that all of your resources are correctly and securely configured. And how do you do so? Obviously, then like you can see, for example, like there are many best practices already, or like some guidance as well provided by the cloud provider from AWS, for example, that can help you set up this kind of to make sure your resources are correctly configured. For example, like this one, the screenshot in here. So this is something that's actually not very new, I would say, within the AWS, for example. But this is as the response as well from a lot of like data breaches happening in the cloud infrastructure in AWS S3, for example, where in the old times the default configuration is that it might be publicly accessible. The storage, the S3 bucket, for example, storage itself might be publicly accessible when you create a new resource, when you create a new bucket storage, basically, right? And then there has been so many cases, as you can see, maybe like in 2019, there was like a lot of data breaches happening just because of like this configuration is not activated by the users, although that is a very simple checkbox, basically. But a lot of people do not realize that there is this configurations available, right? And then in the end, what's happening is that in the past few years ago, that AWS make it, let's say, for all of the newly created resource storage, for example, that it will be already privately. So it's not it will block all the public access already from the get go, which is nice as well, because like a lot of users as well might not, let's say, proficient when it comes to cloud security, or even let alone the cloud in general, basically DevOps and so on. So that's also really good idea as well from the AWS to implement this kind of stuff. But this really shows as well that like we as a cloud customers as well have to understand and also know as well the case for making the cloud resources to be correctly and securely configured. So the third one is that we have to implement least privilege principles to available entities and cloud resources. This means that like certain only authorized entities basically can only access the authorized resources according to their roles or functions. Because the idea was that like you don't want to have like a super user that can, let's say, like maybe an administrator who might have a secure power to so, but not everyone else should have this kind of power, because otherwise, then let's say an unauthorized user will be able to access the data, or maybe even do like, let's say, privilege escalation attack, and this could affecting badly as well. Like this could lead to security breaches and so on, right? So that's the reasons why that we should implement least privilege principle. Certain entities should only access certain resources with the limited permissions based on their roles or functions, for example. So for, as you can see on the screen there, for example, instead of like giving someone, let's say a normal user, AWS administrator access policy, then we should just give, if the person only needs to, let's say, download the file from the S3, certain buckets, for example, then you can just limit it to that particular resources basically for that. And another thing as well, when it comes to monitoring as well, is that we need to set up an adequate logging and monitoring, basically, to know what is the latest cloud states and detect unwanted changes and suspicious activities in cloud infrastructure. So the reason being is that as well is that when it comes to the cloud attacks as well, it's not easy to detect, right? The suspicious attacks could happen anytime, anywhere, and you have to make sure that you actually knows what's going on within your infrastructure. You would like to know or be receiving some alerts, for example, if there is suspicious activities happening, right? So just an example out of it. So that's where the importance of the logging and monitoring is really good for to be, let's say, to be compliant as well with the NIS2 directive. So you have a full overview of what's happening within your infrastructure. So because the thing is that, for example, according to IBM report last year, it takes around could be up to 250 days, basically, for companies to actually realize that they have been attacked, and another 100 days or so to basically to remediate the issues. But imagine 250 days or 270 days, basically, it could around, let's say, 8 to 9 months, basically, of like companies do not realize that they have been attacked. And this could affect badly as well, obviously, for the companies, but also maybe the customers' data and so on. So you would like to be the first person to know when there is something suspicious happening, right? Because otherwise, this could affecting badly. Obviously, that you might lose some money, you might lose your customers, you might lose your let's say your popularity, I would say, when it comes to the customers and so on. So this is something, your trust as well with customers. So this is really important as well for you to set up adequate and logging monitoring services within your cloud infrastructure. And finally, that you have to regularly test your cloud infrastructure, right? So in this case, that you have to make sure that whether is it going to be ready against potential cyber attacks, or also like to help as well to be reducing time to detect and react to potential threats. So in this case, the test could be anything, as I mentioned before. Maybe it could be like a simple security audits, for example, and also maybe penetration testing, for example, or maybe like doing, let's say, simulating or emulating cyber attacks, for example, within your cloud infrastructure, to see how your cloud infrastructure actually the latest current cloud security posture of it, for example, like does it have like misconfiguration within the infrastructure, right? Do they let's say, does the team have the necessary knowledge or understanding as well how to cope, for example, against ransomware attacks? Like, do they have set up necessary alerts, basically, if in case of, let's say a DOS happening, all of these cases as well, for these companies, although like for the mid-sized companies and enterprises, which are most likely going to be affected with by the NIS2 directive, they have to be able to ensure that they are going to be ready for potential cyber attacks that could happen to their infrastructures. And yeah, so this is where that Mitigant basically can help you with that. Basically, we are a German cloud securities SaaS solutions, basically offering that to make the cloud infrastructure to be secure, compliant, and resilient, and we can do it proactively. So what do I mean by that? So for example, in here that we can do cloud security audits automatically, and as well like to make sure as well that like to monitor your cloud infrastructure to be compliant, let's say with certain best practices standards available on the market. For example, ISO 27001, SOC 2, BSIC 5. At the same time as well, that what we do as well, we take inventory of your cloud resources and also monitor your cloud for anything suspicious activities and cloud state changes. So we call it drift management in this regard. And as well that like we are the world's first cyber security product that offering cloud attack emulation, where we can emulate cloud attacks basically for cloud attacks within the infrastructures. So in general, we offer these four functionalities basically, as I mentioned before. Like first one is cloud security posture management, where you can basically run an automated and on-demand cloud security assessments, basically, which is a click of a button. And the second one is that we can also emulate as well, let's say, ransomware attack within your cloud infrastructure to discover the hidden cloud security blind spot, as well as that to help as well to build cyber resiliency so that it will be more prepared against cyber attacks. We will continuously monitor and analyze your cloud infrastructure thanks to the advanced posture security functionality that we have. And finally, as well, if you're also using Kubernetes cluster for your services or for applications, basically, we can also detect and remediate security vulnerabilities within your Kubernetes cluster for that. So yeah, so I'm gonna be showing to you a very short demo as well of like what Mitigant can do basically in this regard. So I hope that you can see the Mitigant's user interface in here. So in here, we of basically providing a SaaS solutions basically, so you can connect your cloud accounts within 15 minutes, and we require certain access permissions basically to your cloud accounts. Basically, you can connect your AWS account, Azure account, or Kubernetes cluster basically within Mitigant, and 15 minutes is already done basically when it comes to the assessment and onboarding for that as well. Right. So as I mentioned in here, we have like the CSPM, the cloud security posture management. So you already know what is your latest security score, basically in this case C. You could also find out as well topmost risky findings as well. For example, in here, where you will see as well the information as well. What are the findings that we actually find during our cloud security assessment? Where also you can see as well what are going to be the remediation steps. So we are offering as well, if it's available as well, obviously the step-by-step manual instruction for the web portal, as well as for the CLI, and also the Terraform later on as well. And yeah, so you can just click for the assessment by click of a button. And as you can see here, you can easily run it every time, whenever that you wanted to do, basically for that. And in here as well, in the same time as well, you can also monitor for compliances with best practices standards on the market. As I mentioned, for example, ISO 27001 or AWS Foundational Benchmark. Also maybe for the CIS benchmark as well. And in Germany, for example, is the BSIC 5. So you can click it and then you can monitor as well the percentage of it are. Where basically like every time that you run assessment, these numbers will be updated as well based on the latest result of the cloud security assessment for it. And for the cloud attack emulation, in here, basically, this is our unique selling point, basically. So it's based on the revolutionary approach called security cluster engineering, where we will basically inject, let's say, reversible security faults within the cloud infrastructure, and then you can see as well how your cloud will behave during this, let's say, cyber attacks, basically on your cloud infrastructure. So we basically implement several of these already several cloud attack actions, basically, and also scenarios as well. Where as you can see in here, we have already current 27, and these are all based on the MITRE attack framework, which is like the framework that are used basically to explain as well how cyber attacks actually happening within the cloud, that could happen basically in an environment. So we are basically creating the scenarios or this cloud attack action as well based on this micro attack framework, as well as also like the latest, let's say, the latest cloud attacks new like that are happening on the news, for example, that we basically drill it down to simple steps basically, where what are the usual causes for it, and then we can emulate it within your cloud infrastructure. So yeah, so in here, for example, that we can, let's say, emulate the create password policy and delete VPC and subnet basically. Also at the same time as well, if you would like to, let's say, emulating, let's say, a ransomware attack, or maybe like RDS disruption, for example, you can easily do it with just a click of a button. And in this regard as well, um, let me just show you an example for it. So we have an attack report where basically in here, then you can combine several attack actions basically into one scenarios basically in here, that you can run it uh, at the same time basically for it. And as you can see in here, then we'll see as well that is actually happening. So obviously, for example, we run the three types of attacks basically in here: it's disable S3 logging, security group default VPC, and public S3 bucket, for example, in this regard. And the idea was that for here as well, you can that as well, okay, you know what, turns out this is already successful, and we will select one, let's say, attack as a proof of the actually attack actually is happening. And then obviously from there as well, you can see as well the remediation of like how to basically, so that you'll be more prepared and more resilient against this kind of attacks. And we'll also show you as well in here the attack evidence, meaning that like whenever that we run something as well, then you can absolutely make sure that it will be recorded within your cloud, within, let's say, your cloud logging monitoring system. For example, in this case for AWS, we are using for CloudTrail basically. So the idea was that, let's say, if your system does not raise an alarm because that you do not have, let's say, necessary, um, let's say, set up a alarm strategy for it, then you can basically use this information basically to create the new alarm strategy to be ready for this kind of attack, for example, right? As well, at the same time as well, we also provide you as well with the attack path analysis as well, meaning that like we'll show you actually how the attack actually is happening as well for it. And nicely as well, you can download as a graph. And yeah, so, and do not worry about this. So every time you run an attack and so on, it will be automatically recovered within 5 minutes, or you can just click manual recovering as well by yourself, and it will be done manually. And finally, what do we offer is that the KSPM, the Kubernetes cluster, Kubernetes security posture management. So basically, we can, in this case, scan your entire Kubernetes cluster for any configuration, for any misconfiguration or compliance violation. In this case, because of that, for example, maybe with the Mitra and Mitra framework, NSA, or maybe from the CIS benchmark as well. And we also analyzing as well the images that are used within the infrastructure, within the Kubernetes cluster when you spawn, let's say, containers and so on into into like the container and clusters in the end, right? So you have to use an images. And the thing is with the Kubernetes security as well, is that like when it comes to the supply chain security, these are also like the start of like where Kubernetes cluster can be exploited or can be hacked basically in this regard, right? Because then they might be using, let's say, vulnerable dependencies and so on, as you can see in here. So you have the CVE and so on, like from this particular images that might not be good. You can see also the severity level out of it as well. So that is the idea of like that. So I'm just giving you a very short introduction to Mitigant basically. Obviously, for that there are also a lot of things that I didn't cover as well to this one. But if you're interested, then we can then you can contact me as well for this information. So yeah, so if you would like to learn more about the NIS2 and how you can make it affect, how it might affect your cloud, and how to make your cloud to be secure as well, then you can just go to mitigant.io/NIS2 as well, NIS2, for more info about it. And yeah, And if you have any questions about Mitigant or in general as well about like how we can help you as well to make it to be NIS2 compliant for your cloud infrastructure, then don't hesitate to contact me in this regard. So thank you very much for that, and I'm looking forward to your questions.